Hi everybody, today we are going to learn about one of the most unique and challenging things that historians like you are tasked to do. When you think about learning about history, I bet you're thinking about the different types of chapters or articles that you read and the different videos or documentaries that you watch. Think back to one of the films we may have watched in this semester, like The War That Made America. You may have watched a little bit about the French and Indian War. And in that film, they talk a lot about the evolution of George Washington from Virginia colonist, British colonist, to a military leader in his own right that would ultimately lead the American Revolution just a few years later. So maybe you watched a film about the Middle Atlantic, the crossing of Black Africans into America by way of the Middle Passage, who were then sold into slavery, and the evolution of American slavery as based on race. We've watched any number of documentaries in this class, and you've read quite a bit. And one of the things that you're likely noticing is that historians tend to take an individual story and put it in a broader historical context. We're not just framing out timelines in this class. We're not just plotting important dates, important battles, important elections. We're looking at the whole story of America as it comes into being during the historical time period that we're analyzing. So for example, if you're taking History 103, you're learning about American history up to the Civil War. And so the question that we're looking at as historians is, how did we get here, right? How did America get to the brink of the Civil War to the point where it was actually fighting itself over the identity and the preservation of this nation? If you're in History 104, you're looking at how America evolved since the Civil War. How did we get here to the political and social divisions in our country that are in existence in the 21st century? If you're in Mexican American history, you're looking at the evolution of Mexican American identity and culture as it evolved from Native forces, Spanish forces, Mexican forces, and American forces. Same is true of African American history or Arizona history. So one of the things that we do as historians, it's really difficult, is we try to tell stories through the perspective of individuals or major events. And to do that, we have to weave two parts together. We have to weave historical context. So the greater, the who, what, when, where, and why, right? Those big questions that you ask when writing an essay. Historical context is really the evolution, or not the evolution, the existence of the entire piece around that person. So we'll take a person, for example, in this lesson. So imagine you're telling your own story. Imagine yourself as a historical actor, as we all are. Your historical context is the framing of the space and the time and the history around you, okay? So let's say this is you. This is you. There are lots of different things that influence your historical context. For example, location, time period, relevant events, right? All of these kinds of things. Maybe political or family connections. Essentially, what's going on in the world around you that is influencing who you are and how you're acting. So for those of you who are living through COVID-19, for example, that's part of your historical context. It may have a lot of influence on your life. Maybe you have family members or loved ones who are suffering from the virus. Maybe your job or your employment has been impacted, or it may not have affected you much at all, right? Either way, it's still part of your context. It's still part of your experiences right now as a student living and working through this time. So that's an example of historical context. The next piece, if we're talking about a person, George Washington, Rosa Parks, Pocahontas, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, right? If we're talking about a human being, we're also weaving in biographical details. So those are unique aspects of that person's identity. So we're gonna read you a story. And what I want you to do is try to identify 5 historical context examples. So remember, that's all of these things that are happening around that person. that are influencing who he or she is. And I want you to come up with 5 biographical details as well, unique to that person's story. Take out a piece of paper and jot down as I read something that will keep in mind for you one of those 5 things. So there's 10 examples at least, there's usually more. And I want you to come up with 5 historical contexts, 5 biographical details. The best way to do this is to take your paper and fold it in half, and on one side write historical context, and on the other write biographical details. All right, this is a lecture on Frederick Douglass. This is the story of Frederick Douglass. He is one of the best known African Americans in history, and as I tell you this story, I want you to take notes. Here's how. On one side of your paper, you're going to write 5 historical context details that you identify from this lecture, and 5 biographical details. All right, Frederick Douglass, it's determined that he was born in 1817 in February. Later, we find that he celebrated his birthday on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day. We know that he was born on the eastern shores of Maryland. So at the time, Maryland was a slave-holding country. It was technically considered part of the South. So Douglass wouldn't have necessarily known his exact birthday because the exact dates of slaves born at that time were not always documented. Instead, it might have just been assumed what year they were born. His mother was a slave woman. Her name was Harriet Bailey. At the time, slave women were sexually exploited by the white men who oversaw their housing and their employment. Slave trade, though, here's the thing, was abolished about 20 years before Frederick Douglass was born. So the slave trade itself was abolished in 1794, which meant no new imported slaves were accepted into America. But slavery, as you know, doesn't end for another 70 years. So how do we continue slavery as a practice and a trade if we're no longer importing people from Africa? Well, Americans, as you remember back in the early stages of the semester perhaps, had innovated a way to continue slavery generationally by basing it on race exclusively. All black bodies were enslaved, and the production of more black bodies became central to the rise of slavery and the kingdom of cotton in our country. So Douglass is born to a slave woman, and he's automatically a slave himself, even though he's born on American soil. Almost immediately, he was separated from his mother, and he experienced very cruel conditions on his plantation where he lived. He later wrote that they were no crueler, however, than any other slave existing in the American South in the late 18th century. He was sent to Baltimore, where he was working for a woman named Mrs. Alt. She was a northern woman who was unaccustomed to the conditions of slavery in the South, and so she taught Douglass to read or write. In those days, it was illegal for African Americans to know how to read or write, and she either didn't know that or she didn't care. This was outlawed across the country, and when her husband found out that she was teaching this black man to read and write, he actually put a stop to it, but Douglass continued educating himself. He once said, quote, "You can never enslave an educated man." In 1838, he ran away. He ran to the north, well, he stayed in the north, which had outlawed slavery in 1804. So it had been over 34 years that slavery itself was outlawed in the north. And so Frederick Douglass remained in the north, trying to avoid being sent back to Baltimore. At this time, blacks had to carry papers, had to carry identification to prove their freedom. He was not free, he ran away. So he borrowed some papers from a friend and impersonated a freed black man. Once he made it to New York City, he adopted the last name Douglass, and he married an escaped black woman from the South. So this is what's happening in Douglass's life as he's moving from Baltimore, which is a pretty far northern town, into the actual proper north. And here's what's happening in the rest of the world, kind of around the concept of slavery, but not necessarily something Douglass is experiencing himself. Beginning in the 1830s, there was this new religious fervor that was sweeping the country. Movements for reform personified the North. You have these religious leaders who believe that we have moral and spiritual obligations to outlaw slavery. They actually say that Christians should not enslave other Christians. It's written in the Bible. But meanwhile, in the South is completely reliant on slavery for their economic survival. Their political leaders and their economic leaders are tied to slavery. You could not have any wealth or power in the South if you were not a landowner and if you didn't employ slaves. They begin to look west. So America's starting to consider moving west, right? And they begin to see that places like Texas, later Arizona, California, all of these places are, Kansas, Nebraska, are ripe for agriculture. And slavery is the primary labor force when it comes to agriculture. So meanwhile, the northern industries are booming. But here's what's really important to know, is that the North is not booming on account of its own designs, right? The North is designing and developing textiles. Textiles are like paper or fabric, right? Both of those things are from cotton. So the North is experiencing this huge wave of industrial boom, where they're able to produce things like books and money and paper and cloth. And they're able to, just think about the amount of paper that you come into contact with, even like a little sleeve for your coffee, right? That's made of cotton. And so the North is developing raw cotton into usable goods and then exporting them into Europe and Asia and then also throughout the country. So the North is capitalizing on slavery. They're making a ton of money off of slavery, and the South is making a ton of money off of slavery. And the two regions, they were called sections at the time, were locked in this interrelated relationship. It was not as though the North was independent of slavery at all. So Douglass joins the abolitionist movement in North. This was a movement of people, religious leaders, political leaders in the North, who really were advocating the outlaw of slavery. But by doing that, by advocating for the end of slavery, they were really advocating for the decline of the South and ultimately the end of the country's wealth as they understood it at the time. So it would have been wildly radical at the time. Douglass begins publishing. Remember how it was illegal for him to learn to read and write initially? Well, now he's actually publishing papers and articles that are going out across the country talking about the ills and evils of slavery. He's also speaking out against slavery, and he becomes very well known in the country, which actually makes him a target. He is under threat constantly of violence. This is right at the beginning of what's called the antebellum era in America. Antebellum is actually just a French word for pre-war or before conflict, but in general, the word antebellum, though that's a vocabulary word, that term itself relates almost exclusively to the beginning years of the American Civil War. So even though it's a global term, it's a French term, it really uniquely relates to those very first years before the Civil War in America. At this time, antebellum is defined by increasing hostilities and divisions among Northerners and Southerners. Former slaves like Frederick Douglass face the threat of capture. So even though he has been living in the North and he has been living and working as a freed man, he never actually secured his freedom. Remember, he ran away. Like him, slaves who ran away, but also slaves who had been freed previously by their owners for whatever reason, were vulnerable to what was called the fugitive slave law at the time. The fugitive slave law was a guarantee by the Supreme Court that any found Black person in the North who was perceived to be a runaway slave could be and must be returned to their slave-owning home. So what this meant was that if you couldn't prove, if you were a runaway slave or even if you were a freed slave, if you could not prove your freedom, that not only was the South allowed to, remember, people living in the South, not only were they allowed to come to the North, kidnap you and take you back to take you to their plantation, actually Northerners themselves and Northern police forces were responsible for facilitating that exchange. So this really put people like Douglass at a very extreme vulnerability. This was a result, the fugitive slave law was a result of compromises, a series of compromises made among the North and the South in Congress as they tried to determine what to do about their expanding empire in the West and the increasing divisions and hostilities among the North and South. Ultimately, what these divisions show us is that America was truly destined for civil war. They were set up to fail. They were set up to have a conflict that was going to bring down the entire country. And at this time, Frederick Douglass, during this era of extreme hostility, during this era of extreme uncertainty, he becomes the leading Black writer to witness the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it's through his words that we understand the experiences of Black men and women in America, because ultimately most of the documented information we have tends to be from white soldiers, white women living and working on homesteads. But because of Douglass, we know a lot about how Black Americans experienced this crazy war as well. All right, you should have more than enough, right? You were looking for examples of historical context, things that were happening around Douglass at the time, and biographical details, things that were unique to Douglass himself. All right, keep that. I can't wait to see what you think, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this activity.